Okay? If you've watched one of these before, I like to start with a quote, and this week's is show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome. Now, what are you going to get out of watching this video? Well, I'm going to talk about house prices. I'm going to talk about Trumponomics and how the Donald has been in the past 7 days or so, what he's influenced and not. I'm going to talk about London. I'm going to talk about what prices are doing down there. I'm going to talk about inflation, unemployment, but most importantly, what it all means for the UK property market and prices for 2026. So, that quote that I gave you earlier, Charlie Munger, one of my favourite investors of all time, a hero of mine, it pertains towards the deep dive. I'm going to get stuck into a number of reports, including the government's Warm Homes Plan, which came out this week. I doubt you've wanted to sit and read the 152 pages that are involved in it. And the good news is you won't need to, because I'll be going into it for you. But as the calendar advances through our golden quarter at the first part of 2026, the next Property Business Workshop is live and tickets are already selling for it. So this one's all about structure and exit, yours and others. No exit plan? Well, you go out one way or another. So things have changed as well, with pensions being brought out of this into the scope of your personal estate for inheritance tax. So what does this mean for SASs? This is according to people that actually use them rather than selling any products. It's an objective viewpoint. So book in on our next Property Business Workshop, myself and Rod Turner. It's Wednesday the 22nd of April in central Manchester. And the link is bit.ly/PBWTEN and then 10. So I wanted to do a quick appreciation snippet actually for both my business partner Rod. It was absolutely on fire at our workshop this week in London that we held. There are some various AI enhanced clips available on the YouTube and on my other social media for a bit of a chuckle. But every attendee also who trusted us with their valuable time, who came along, attended and participated as we attempted to solve productivity, strategic planning and financial accountancy, bookkeeping, group accounting and the likes. So first up, we're into Trumponomics. He wouldn't accept any other slot in the supplement now, would he? So don't want to get myself in any more trouble than I probably already am. It's hard to move too far without bringing up Greenland, of course, and we've seen a number put on what we think is inevitably an acquisition, which is the official White House line anyway, rather than bothering ourselves with the Donald's hourly puffery. That word acquisition is deliberately being used, in my opinion. It sounds like a snip at $700 billion. Well, it sounds like a lot, actually, doesn't it? But likewise, for the mighty US, it also sounds like nothing. Although, of course, they've probably got another government shutdown to consider, so do bear that in mind. Bad news, though, really is that Donald wants to pay $33 and a bag of chips, or a deferred deal over 1,000 years, of course. Okay, there's a little bit of artistic license at play there from me, but the deal is everything, as we know with Mr. T, so let's see what happens. You don't want to play ball? Have some tariffs. Now, it's a bit tiring, to be honest, isn't it? But taco has been mentioned all over the place this week once again. Trump always chickens out. Markets recoil. They don't like the chat. He changes his focus and his rhetoric and starts laying the charm offensive on. Chicken soup it was, really. The chat changed to a framework for Arctic cooperation. Sounds good, doesn't it? Doubt that came from the mouth of the Donald himself. But if you're a conspiracy theorist, it offers very little any more fuel than Davos and the World Economic Forum. Trump was humbled, if you're a lefty, by Mark Carney this week. If you're more Trump sympathetic or Trump curious at least, he simply came into line with what Trump has been saying all along. Take security seriously instead of underinvesting in defence and relying on the peace dividend and America being the world's policeman. What do I think? Well, as usual, Trump's America is fairly easy to understand. You guys need to spend a lot more on defence. And by the way, we sell some great stuff in that department. Isn't that helpful? Now, if you go too far, which arguably he's already done, and then those countries don't buy American, well, that's backfired a little bit, hasn't it, apart from anything else? And they'd be sensible to do that. At the local authority level in the UK, they call it the Preston model, as it was coined. You know, invest locally. When you spend money, spend it locally. And guess what? That helps the local economy. Who'd have thought it? But we don't much like or trust him at the moment. But we still trust him or like him more than we like Putin or Xi, let's face it. And he knows that. He'd have to go quite a long way to go behind those two, of course. But by driving these middle powers together, as Carney coined that phrase this week, some of this definitely runs a risk of backfiring for the US. Just as the developed world has reshored some production and manufacturing and hedged its bets against the dependency on China being the world's manufacturer, as it was when COVID came, the US actively influencing just where items get purchased purchased from. But are they influencing it in a way they want to, or are they influencing away from themselves? That's a question in itself, right? So yields started to drift a bit on the wrong way on the back of some of the rhetoric from last week, and that also starts to impact the UK, of course, and I'll cover that later on. But the rest of the UK-centric Trump news concentrated on the critique of the Chagos silence deal, which he's been vocal enough about. Anyway, Chris Watkin is back, and I'm excited because it's been about 4 weeks since we've had anything from Chris because of the Christmas hiatus and because the figures run a little bit in arrears, of course, as well. So it's back to our relative calm of the UK real-time property market. This time for speculation over the past month is over. The time for real stats is upon us, and I'm sure you can hear the delight in my voice. This is covering week 2 of the 2026 property market. So that is he goes Sunday to Sunday, Chris does, with his stats. So this is week ending 11th of January. So 2 weeks ago today. We managed even more listings than we did in the beginning of 2025. Just about. So far, 61,351 versus 61,161. So very, very close. But they're massive standouts compared to how many listings you normally get in the first week or two of a year. And there's obviously a bit of an overhang there from Boxing Day and those agents who decided to push the early January listing rather than the Boxing Day listing. We remember we had these headlines about record number of listings on Boxing Day as well. So that's not captured in all of this because it starts from the 1st of January, to be clear. So big amount of stock come onto the market in the past few weeks. So the glut of listings really looks back at the moment. We had a lot of holding off, but how much of it was budget, how much of it was higher value stock? We know a fair bit of it was higher value stock because the new listed asking prices were down really quite significantly at some points in the back end of last year. How about reductions then? Well, only 7.6% of homes on the market were reduced in December, and the average for 2025 closed at 12.8% reduced every month. 10.7 is the 5-year average, but that 5-year average probably needs extending, Chris, if you happen to listen to this, because I think 2021 and 2022 impacted that a little bit. So 12.5%, about 1 in 8 every month doesn't look too ridiculous to me, but it just shows you how many homes are reduced. Nearly 20,000 reductions, less than the start of 2025, which opened with 21,690, but nearly 20,000 is still a huge outlier on the upside compared to every other year since 2017. So at the start of a year, you often see these significant price gaps between asking prices of listings and sales agreed. You see the same gap again in September when the summer holidays is over. This week was no different. £423,000 average listing price, average sold subject to contract price, £346,000. 22.2% that difference. Typical range is more like 16 to 17%, which is what we expect to see as the year goes on, and just shows you how much is reduced and how much is negotiation and how much is gamesmanship when a property goes on the market. And ultimately, the agents run this process, right? They over-instruct to get the deals on. They try and sign people into long contracts, and they have to play this silly game where things sell 16 to 17% lower on average than what they're listed at as a rule. Although remember, only just over 50% of what's listed actually sells, which is a mind-blowing statistic when you think about it. But that system is just broken, in my opinion. And that's why you always say, ignore the asking price and get on with what you think it's worth. Much easier when you buy relatively cheap stock like we do, because it's very much commoditized. So everyone knows what it's worth, and there's not worth too much puffery and all the rest of it that goes on. It is what it is. Next door's worth the same, next door but one's worth the same, etc., right? The week 2 average is 19,600 sold subject to contracts for years gone by, but there were 21,200. So the market looks healthy enough in the snapshot that we've got so far. All the other comparisons that Chris does, it's just too early in the year for us to discuss them because we haven't got enough data being in week 2. But net sales for week 2 were 15,800. Again, healthy enough compared to the 10-year average, 14,400. So the volume looks okay. What about prices per square foot agreed? Well, we need to be a little bit cautious on this metric because of distortion around the 2025 budget, although arguably that might have pushed prices per square foot up. I don't think it would have done. I think it would have pushed them down because more expensive stock isn't necessarily only because it's bigger. It's the old location, isn't it, really? December was up 0.6% in terms of prices per square foot on sales agreed. This is Chris's favourite metric because it filters through to the land reg with a huge 98% correlation with about a 5-month lag. So you really are seeing what's going to happen at the land reg in 5 months' time. And that was nationwide figure for 2025, wasn't it? 0.6%. So maybe it is only accurate. But I have got the actual ONS land reg figures a little bit later on, and you'll see that they disagree with that quite a bit, as I stated and suspected that they would. But let's see what happens. Are they not going to be exciting for the next few months, given that length of that accuracy in the correlation that goes on? And were they disturbed by people over 500 grand holding off before the budget? There was a bit of time, but not a lot of time. Remember, the budget was right at the end of November, and ultimately that meant that a lot of people didn't list in December and might well be listing in January. Hence why the asking price has moved up so much. Oh, seems to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it, really? But we started this January with a 10-year plus record in terms of number of homes on the market, 613,882. That was obviously thanks to that Boxing Day glut, apart from anything else. 2025, we started with 605,088 on the market. We go back years before that, and it's considerably less, especially in the hotter years like 2021. And then one more stat before drawing out our first Watkin breakdown of 2026 to a close. Available rental properties in the UK, December 2025, 285,000. That compares to 258,000 December 2024 and 235,000 in December 2023. Supply is increasing again. A longer time frame is needed to put all of that into context, but if new rents are flat or even down, which some are telling me that they are, 10.5% more stock than the year before tells a story, of course. Chris, it's great to have you back, mate. I missed you. Now, anyway, on to the macro outlook now. We had the labour market report and unemployment figures with the currently usual fuss around particular items, including youth unemployment. I usually call this week of the month meat week because there's so much going on the macro side. And labour market figures get followed up by inflation numbers. Guess what? Well, there's no need to guess because I'm going to tell you. The ONS house prices and rents were also out as well. Bullseye as far as we're concerned in terms of what we're worried about. And then, of course, New Year, same closing item. We have to talk about the gilts and the swaps. So that brings up the rear as always. So unemployment and the labour market, everything's fine, right? Nothing to see here. I think you know that's not true. The economic consensus was that November, which is what this data is reporting on, would see a pullback to only 5% unemployment, but it didn't happen. It stayed at the 5.1 that it hit for October. Year on year and quarter on quarter figures didn't raise much of a smile either. 135,000 net payroll jobs lost over 12 months and 43,000 lost over the quarter September to November 25. So sad times, really. December's early estimate forecast also looks terrible, but these early estimate forecasts they do at the ONS are not up to much. So hopefully we do better than another 43,000 jobs lost just in December. That did make a few headlines, of course, but we've seen some horrible predictions over the last 12 months that then eased quite a bit when the real data came in. But the retail figures for December weren't so bad in general, so we did not had an incredibly disappointing Christmas in general, although I did talk about my anecdotal December adventures, which saw quite a lot of quiet venues out there. Maybe I just hang around in the wrong places, I don't know. But when we get to the meat and the layer beyond the headline unemployment figure, we see employment at 75.1%. Unchanged on the last quarter, up on 1 year ago. How when unemployment has moved up so much? Well, simply because fewer are economically inactive, that dreaded measure that causes so much controversy. The number is 20.8%. And I always point out how this miraculously all adds up to 101% each time, because the unemployed are not bounded by their age. The other two categories are. It just means you're over 16 and you're looking for work. The others are bounded by the 65th birthday of the people in question, which these days is silly anyway because pension age is 67. But look, they've got enough problems at the ONS without me giving them any more, I'm sure. But what we're absolutely not at, right, at the moment, according to the Bank of England forecast, is wage rises under control. So that's where we were supposed to be by the end of 2025, if not before, and seeing a 4% print. 4.7 for November doesn't suggest we'll see a 4% print for 2025 in the end. And this feeds into the rate setters, right? The Monetary Policy Committee, they'll be considering this. So it's because of this huge gulf between private sector and public sector pay rises. So private sector 3.6%, the rate setters could absolutely get along with that one. That seems relatively in line, good bit of progression. If inflation was 2, you'd be seeing a 1.5% real terms pay rise. So even I'd be happy about that for the overall economy in aggregate. We're not seeing any of that, but he printed a massive 7.9 for the public sector. I've been into long arguments before about what needs to happen to public sector pay. Normally someone tries to shoot me when I have this conversation. They don't even wait to listen to what I've got to say. But I absolutely support it being the same as private sector pay, with the bargaining chip being public sector pension reform. So not clipping total remuneration, just having realistic pension schemes and liabilities rather than schemes that are simply unsustainable and offer incredibly bad value to everybody involved, right? There's a base effect here that the ONS promise will be phased out over the next 3 months. Basically, some pay rises were brought forward, and so there were 2 rises in 1 year, but you can still see even with 2 rises in 1 year, you don't get 3.6 and 3.6, and that add up to 7.9. So it's still rising above the private sector. But let's see when that washes out. We promised that will happen in the next 3 months. The stats that you really need to know on this stuff. Employers have a 40% average cost on top of the employee's salary in the public sector, 40, right? Compared to the public sector, 16%. So really tells you what you need to know. It's 2.5 times the extra cost to employ a public sector worker. And it's all in that pension side of things, folks, right? So inflation has hurt what should be a majestic pay increase, right? The real terms after CPIH, which the ONS prefers to CPI because it includes housing costs. The increase 0.8 or 1.1 if you take the CPI adjusted one. About half of where you'd like to be in a healthy enough economy if you wanted to have consumption growing at a nice pace, which would see GDP growing at a nice pace. Imagine that. And we also lost 155,000 labour days, working days to labour disputes in November 2025. Worse since January 2024, the previous administration. And why was it? Well, it was the doctor's strike, which we'll all remember. Bit of a step backwards there. But quietly hidden in the data, there is a little reason to maybe be a bit cheerful. So let's make the most of it. 10,000 more job vacancies over the quarter. And that represents the best of the basically flat last 6 months after vacancies are created post-COVID. So better up than down. And then the inactivity rate being down 0.2 over the quarter, you could argue you could take that off the unemployment rate to get a true picture. Well, 5.1% unemployed in November would be equivalent to 4.9 in August, because that 0.2 you've brought away from economically inactive. But of course, they're then seeking employment, but they've got to find a job, right? So it's a reasonable methodology. However, August number was 4.8, not 4.9. So it's still getting a little bit worse. Economically inactive, what did that split into, by the way? Students, historically the biggest category, but not anymore. Long-term sick, now the biggest category. Looking after the home or retired early. And out of interest, of those 9+ million people that shake down into that age bracket, into those categories, 2.8 million long-term sick, 2.5 million studying, 1.7 million looking after the home, and 1.1 million in early retirement, although quite a few have been pushed back into work after COVID due to the adjustments in the cost of living that they hadn't necessarily seen coming. So still, the unemployment rate in August was 4.8, as I say. So however you slice that lemon, it's still coming down to the employer's national insurance shock of October 2024, right? Labour absolutely have to be held to account for not creating enough jobs or destroying too many, or both. The moves around the minimum wage for young people have destroyed youth employment. 16 to 24 sitting at 15.9%. That doesn't count sick. It doesn't count looking after the house. It doesn't count students. That's 38.6% more. Of course, many of them are students, and that has been the push. But still, if we appreciate only 51.7% of 16 to 24s are in work, so we're not talking about 16 to 18, we're talking about 16 to 24s, right? Roughly half of 16 to 24s being in work probably doesn't feel as healthy as it should do. It certainly doesn't sound particularly healthy to me. So limited reasons to be cheerful. I highly doubt private sector vacancies are up, actually. So this 10,000 increase in vacancies, you know, jolly good. But is it private sector or public sector? The ONS don't go into that level of detail in their reporting. You'll have to go deep into the source data to get it. Public sector has done markedly worse than the headline figures, because the public sector has been propped up by the funding that comes from the private sector, of course, right? So Bank of England's initial analysis, so all these job losses, there are more job losses than that because the public sector has added jobs, is what I'm saying, to be clear. And the Bank of England suggested when they first looked at it that it would be 2 full years for the employer's national insurance shock to work through the system. That takes us out to April 2027, of course, so we're not even 50% of the way through it time-wise, but I think we could suggest at least 50% of the incidence of it has already taken place. maybe 60 to 70% has already taken place. But there's still self-inflicted harm to come throughout 2026, and it's why my prediction for unemployment for 2026, as it stands, is 5.7% by the end of the year. Will inflation cheer us up? Well, maybe it should. I mean, I do say that we as property investors are the second biggest beneficiaries of inflation behind HM government. And that's because of all that nominal debt and it being inflated away by rent increases and the likes. However, when capital values only move a very small amount, the low effort part of the deal, when it's less than the frictional cost of selling a house, for example, then you've got to consider the tax and you've got to consider the fact that property is a depreciating asset over time, doesn't necessarily placate anyone. Still, a reminder of where we were. It was 3.2% inflation for November. This was CPI. Consensus would have a little bounce back to 3.3 for December because prices do always go up in December, of course, because people have got money in their pocket. There's a scarcity out there. There's a time deadline for Christmas and people loosen the belts a little bit apart from anything else. We didn't see 3.3. We saw 3.4 above the forecast again. So core inflation was on the button at 3.2. It's still its joint lowest print since late 2021, unbelievably, but another reason why I don't see 2% inflation anytime particularly soon. It always gaps down in January, right? How deep are the January sales? But RPI hit 4.2 for December, up 0.7 month on month. So there's always that base effect. And then last January's figures will drop out when January's figures are in, right? So last January was down 0.4% in terms of inflation. So if we see the same again, we wouldn't see any base effect. We're going to see more than that. So how deep are those January sales? What do you think? Leave me a comment along those lines if you're listening. So at a push, I'd suggest maybe down inflation is down a little bit, but not a lot when we get to those figures, right? The ONS prefers the CPIH measure, as I said, from a data integrity perspective, and that was 3.6, up from 3.5 in November. Now, that's the equivalent to the US CPI, really, because it does include those housing costs. So where were the upward pressures? Alcohol, tobacco, and transport. Sounds like a pretty fun month, to be honest with you. CPI and CPIH services converged at 4.5%, and I've maintained that it's going to be pretty hard, given that services make up 53% or so of the actual CPI figure, to get to a 2% inflation target while those are still running this hot. Minimum wage is up 4.9 if you include the increase in pension contributions and employers' national insurance contributions to the 4.1% rise. Business rates are now capped. Oh, gee, thanks, Rachel. At only a 15% rise in the struggling retail, leisure and hospitality sectors. Council tax we haven't seen yet, but the conventional wisdom states that budgeting for a 4.99% increase is the best strategy. Is this feeling like 2% inflation in Q2 of this year for you? It isn't for me. Right now, look, we know these base effects are dropping out. We look at this guaranteed drop in energy bills as well, which will be about 7% off the energy bills according to the current estimates for the price cap. It's going to be between 110 and 140 quid. That's the current estimate. So won't be as good as this promised £150, which is why Labour have stopped using the £150 number, because they know they're going to fall short on it apart from anything else. But they will go down. And of course, they keep hanging on about the train tickets being frozen, which I've said before, matter dramatically if you're a season ticket holder and don't mean anything to you if you're not, realistically. So a very targeted benefit for some middle class households, I would imagine, who spend significant amounts on their season tickets. I know a few that do, and they are eye-watering sums of money. So they won't be sorry about the extra 300 quid, 400 quid, 500 quid they might have in their net pay for the year on the back of all of that. So that's useful. What about the more granular parts of inflation? Food inflation 4.5, again more likely to be impacted than other industries by the minimum wage increases that are incoming once again. I always look at OOH, the owner-occupier measure of housing. That's what's injected into CPI to make it into CPIH as it goes. Got to have seen 2025 as a success. It was 8% in January 2025, and it came down to 4%, 4.2% in December. So still puts CPIH above CPI, of course, but those are really converging to a much more steady state. It's just the steady state they're converging towards is still 3.5% rather than 2%, but there we go. Okay, and rent inflation. The last time rent inflation contributed less to CPIH than it did in December was May 2022. So I've ridden that wave upwards and downwards and come back to something a bit more reasonable, right? So my UK rent number is 3.5% up for 2026, but that is fairly bearish compared to some other forecasts. But My reasoning is it's going to be tempered downwards by rent increases in London and the southeast, because affordability is a problem for people in London and southeast. So my inflation number for context for the end of the year, 2.7%. I actually ended up 0.3% out for last year. I said 3.1 by the end of 2025. Many people said something starting with a 2, including big forecasting houses. So once again, the inflation hawk over here, Mr. Propenomix, was right. Or righter than them anyway, less wrong than them, maybe I should say. So I was at 3.2 in November as well. I thought I might hit it smack on if I was lucky, but it didn't look like it for a December month, but there we go. Back to target, low 2s, 2%. The Bank of England keep telling us Q2 2020. Well, we'll see if they've modified that prediction when we get to the next meeting with an inflation report, which is February's meeting, early Feb's meeting. So only a week or so away, week and a half away from that meeting as I'm recording this. Let's see. I suspect they might have tweaked that back upwards a little bit, having seen the recent inflation numbers. But let's see. What about house prices in some detail then? The index that never makes the headlines, but the only one with all the real data and the transactions, right? The number, November 2025, is still where the ONS has just calculated for pricing, and then rents are December 2025. Always a little bit confusing, this report, but I always try and make that qualifying point. What did the ONS say? 2.5% up year on year, up from 1.9 in their October figure. My estimate has been more like 1.5 from the Watkin data in the middle of last year, but I definitely over-egged it with my forecast of 3.75%, but who knows where the final print is going to end up. What am I predicting for this year? A pretty meagre 1.5%, folks, I'm afraid, but again, higher in the Midlands and the North, and tempered by a London market that will be continuing to struggle. Probably find its bottom at some point this year, you would think. The ONS have prices down in London, so do all the other indices over the course of the last 12 months, but you've got a huge supply gap coming up because, well, we'll talk about that when we talk about the Molly-Orr report. Let's leave it till then. Their rents are much closer to real time, as I say, so up 4%, down from the 4.4% November print, so very much in line with the OOH figure that was talked about in the inflation report. The ONS, why are their numbers better here? Well, they have 550,000 rents that they consider. Everybody else who analyses rents just talks about asking price rents, so pretty useless to a large extent, right? They had London rents going up 2.1%, and the North East leading the charge at 7.9% upwards. Welsh rents are leading the nations as a whole, with the same price actually as Northern Ireland, although the Northern Ireland figures are a few months old, so I don't talk about them very often because they're pretty much in the past. But they both printed 5.7% up for the year. And Scotland still adjusting after the rent cap days, although there are questions over the Scotland methodology, which I'll talk about in a bit. But they still printed 2.8% up on the rents. But what about the capital values? Well, Scotland's leading the charge at 4.4% up on capital values. So you'd think dropping yields in Scotland. England at 2.2, Wales at 0.7 in the same time period. So why the gap between Halifax, Nationwide and the ONS, right? Now, it's often observed that the two biggest industry indices are more predictive and reflective of real time and what's going on in terms of what's being agreed, not in terms of what transactions are completing. And that's why there's usually a 5 to 6 month lag when people show the ONS and the Halifax and the Nationwide indices on the same graph, right? Now, the ONS, as I say, is the only one who's got all the data, so they're the ones that I trust in terms of what's really happened from an academic viewpoint. But Halifax and Nationwide are still useful for a nowcast or a real-time take. They're both big businesses, obviously they both do a reasonable amount of volume. So there'll always be a bit of a difference. We also know much more about the ONS methodology and much less about the methodology of Halifax and the Nationwide, because some of it is obviously commercially sensitive. Apart from else, they wouldn't want someone else just replicating all of their data, although obviously they've got internal data that would be very difficult to replicate. But we know that lots of more expensive houses weren't selling. We know that they were held off the market in the first place. And with that in mind, perhaps the Halifax and Nationwide prints were falsely low. I don't know. Perhaps they were. It might be fair to say I'd rather use the ONS prices, as I always say. Always held to account by the ONS prices. The ONS in November saw London prices down 1.2% on the year. North East up 6.8% on the year. And it's just typical high to low, North, Midlands, South, right? Cheapest regions to most expensive. But London was the only region printing a negative. England's average rent now £1,424 per calendar month, up 3.9 on the year in England, just above inflation. Wales £822, Scotland £1,018, although the ONS did reveal that this is on new rents in Scotland, although they did use or make some moves to use in-tenancy rent increases from September 22 to March 2025. I don't know how helpful that all is, because it makes it very difficult for it to seem to be apples and apples. It sounds a bit more like apples and oranges, doesn't it? Having just praised the 550,000 data set, it doesn't seem that they've got enough in Scotland to be able to be trusting that too much. So the rent graph, the rent bar chart looks exactly the same as the capital values graph actually, but shifted a couple of percentage points to the right. So the North East, I told you already, 7.9% up. London's 2.1% increases in rents. The next lowest to that was the Southeast at 3.8. So yields are still increasing, right? As the market continues on its quest for some element of equilibrium, never going to happen. An adjustment of balance after the 2022 disruption and the renormalization of the interest rate, or whatever we want to call it these days. So no real new trends to draw from any of that. It's more of the same, but I like to know the actual numbers. And thanks for staying with me. Hopefully you want to know them as well, and that's why you're here. So what about the gilts and swaps? Because this is the week where the market's jerked back from the 200 billion in bond announcements from Mr. Trump. Right, remember his purchase of these mortgage-backed securities that I talked about last week. He waves, kicking and screaming. His one-trick tariff pony does what he does. He's done at points throughout the last year or so. And it did what it did to the markets around Liberation Day in 2025, although not as dramatic. He then calmed down, and that taco trade that I already talked about, Trump always chickens out, seemed to pay off again for those who were willing to take it. But we lost this week as borrowers what we gained the week before. So the open for the week, 3.884 on the 5-year gilt, and then 3.992 to close, mercurially staying below that 4%. A 10 basis point jump, really quite significant on Thursday when Trump came out swinging. Volatility prevails, it's clear, while he remains in charge. So another 3 years to go there, although the midterms will define just how powerful he is across the board with the Senate and the House of Reps. Let's see what goes on that front. That's why he's putting all this extra effort in at the moment to win that midterm election. His last election, or is it? The longer dated bonds, the 30s, went from 5.212 to 5.273. So the yield curve got a bit shallower, at least, but they put on 6 basis points compared to the 11 basis points that the 5 years put on. And the swap held up on Thursday's close. It didn't change an awful lot, about 7 basis points on the week, closing at 3.657. So the flex really plays out in the discount to the gilt first and the sensitivity to the gilt yield second, right? Identical to 1 month ago's pricing, and still comparing favourably to January 2025, which was miserable for rates news, and when the bond vigilantes still had the wind behind them, of course. It was a 3.993% print on the swap. So we were looking at basically mortgage rates of 5.8 to 6.2 around that sort of time. We're about 35 basis points better off than that point. And there are some rates a little bit lower, although I'd question the integrity of some of the places that offer them, because they have an extreme habit of downvaluing in the face of fair evidence, left, right, and centre. So the bottom dollar rates are not 75% loan to value, in my opinion. But anyway, what filtered through to the retail punters via the news? Well, slower rates of cuts, this therefore means. That's what they were told. The market's prediction for rates in 1 year's time is now split between 3.25% and 3.5% for base rate. So this week's deep dive couldn't ignore the changes, and semi-clarity, I suppose, is a fair way of saying where we are now, which was better than no clarity at all, which is what we did have before the start of this week, to the EPC legislation, which we've got to get stuck into. Right? Is the warm homes plan being warmly received here at Propenomix HQ? You'll find out. The Bank of England talks about the impact that the changes to EPCs and the government consultations on the matter have had thus far in mortgage rates. So that's also in the crosshairs. And Mollior's first report on resi development in London for 2026 was out, and we've got to take a look. Zupla also produced a short report on homes in 2025, slipping out the news that half of them increased in value, which, so you know what the two options might be for the other half, don't you? Sideways and down, right? So what about the EPCs? Well, clarity and victory claimed by the NRLA here. Perhaps just a quick revision of where we were at before I dive into the report. We had a mooted cap of £15,000 needing to spend on a property to get it to C or above by 2028 for new tenancies and 2030 for existing. But this 2028 pipe dream, and it was always a pipe dream, has been shelved. The cap is down to 10k, and for properties cheaper than 100k in value, the cap will be 10% of the property's value. Still sounds like an awfully large percentage to me, but there we go. There's one date for all of this, October 2030. Also, there was chatter that the EPC validity period would be reduced to 5 years, but now we've been told that's not the case, which is helpful. Any EPCs done before October 2029 will be valid for another 10 years. When does the current 2012 introduced RD SAP calculation methodology get replaced by this HEM, this home energy model methodology? Well, they're still saying 2026, but it's unclear when and how the old model gets phased out, or whether it runs side by side in a transition period for a while, perhaps something like that. So we'll find out, won't we? The controversial bit really is that it takes a dim view of gas boilers, this new home energy model, and 85% of homes still have a gas boiler. The other 15%, 10% electric, 4% oil or LPG, mostly because of geographical location, of course, and less than 2% with a heat pump. 1.5 million new boilers are installed each year versus about 65,000 or so heat pumps. That puts that into context for you, I think, quite nicely. So you're talking less than 5% of heat pumps compared to the number of new boilers that there are. It's obviously still larger than if around 1 in 50 have got a heat pump rather than got a gas boiler, and around 1 in 20-ish or so, 1 in 25 are having a heat pump. You can see the difference in where they'll converge, but there's hardly moving at light speed, and I don't think it's going to move at light speed, to be honest with you. If they ignore those figures, there'll be blood on the carpet for people, let's face it. But what did the government say about the Warm Homes Plan? It's only 152 pages, so let's get into it. Don't worry, we're going into reporting mode. The government's Warm Homes Plan finally landed, and it's a beast of a document. It charts the course for a complete overhaul of the UK's ageing housing stock, a mission that the current administration is framing as the central pillar, well, of course it is, because all the other ones have been taken away, Ed, haven't they, apart from anything else, of its quest to become a clean energy superpower. The headline figure of 15 billion in public investment is designed to grab attention, but the devil, as always, is in the detail of how this money will be deployed. And there's a little bit of trickery in here that the Labour government are using quite a bit. Not that I disapprove of it as it goes, but it sounds better than it is normally what it means. How will the regulatory teeth be sharpened that enforce this transition? So I've identified the 4 most significant pillars of this report: the massive financial injection into clean heat, the rooftop revolution of solar and storage, the tightening of the screw on the rental sector, and the creation of a new state-led delivery agency. So theme 1 is the £15 billion electrification gambit. So it's this record public investment in this parliament to upgrade up to 5 million homes by 2030. The investment is part of a broader £38 billion total investment package designed to cut energy bills and tackle fuel poverty. Central to this is the expansion of the boiler upgrade scheme, or the BUS as it's known, £2.7 billion to provide universal grants of up to £7,500 for heat pump installations. The plan also includes a new £5 billion Warm Homes Fund, which includes £1.7 billion for low and zero interest consumer loans to help homeowners meet the upfront costs of their panels, batteries and heat pumps. Government's analysis suggests that a typical household adopting a heat pump, solar PV and a battery could save about £550 a year on energy bills compared to their gas boiler. Now for the Propenomix perspective, folks, because I've seen many landmark energy plans in my time in this game, but this one actually really has some fiscal weight behind it. 15 billion quid is a serious chunk of change, and that shift towards low interest loans via the Warm Homes Fund is a pragmatic admission that the state cannot simply grant its way out of the efficiency crisis. They do mostly need to be zero interest, in my opinion, because payback periods are what scuppered the Green Deal that you might remember way back when. However, I'm a natural sceptic when it comes to typical bill savings. The 550 quid savings figure relies on a best case scenario involving high performing heat pumps and expensive battery storage. In the real world, the ROI for an owner-occupier is heavily dependent on the current gilt yields and the prevailing SONIA swap rates that the lenders will use to price these low-interest loans. If the private sector doesn't play ball with the government's strategic partnership, these loans won't nearly be as attractive as the press release suggests. Theme 2 is unleashing the rooftop revolution. So the summary is, the government's aiming to triple the number of homes with solar panels by 2030. That'll be another 3 million installations. The rooftop revolution is a core component of the plan to reach 45 to 47 gigawatts of solar capacity by the end of this decade. To support this, the plan integrates solar and battery storage into its capital investment programs for low-income households. We kind of knew that was coming. And it offers the aforementioned low-interest loans for owner-occupiers. Furthermore, the plan emphasises the role of consumer-led flexibility, encouraging the use of home batteries and households using a battery with the use of time tariff as well, like charging overnight, discharging during the day, for example, and with smart meters and all the rest of it, project that could save another 300 quid annually. To ensure that new builds contribute to this is the reason for the future home standard requiring solar panels as standard from 2026. So what's my perspective on this? Well, I actually like this focus on solar and storage. If you asked Elon himself, and of course he's talking his own book to an extent, but solar is the answer. He's been consistent on that message for over a decade now. Even in the United Kingdom, remember, you don't actually need sun, you just need light apart from anything else. That's what photovoltaic refers to, aside from anything else. If you're thinking solar panels are rubbish in England, they're not so bad, right? So Labour loved solar. The last time they were in government, they put in this feed-in tariff scheme. You might remember it, you might have heard of it. There were renting a roof activities that went on that were the difficult part of that are still causing people problems with selling houses in 2026, actually, as it goes. But if you bought your own panels, I bought half a dozen sets at the time for properties that I was involved with. So that included, I invested in them basically. So that included, for example, my parents' own house and things like that, because the numbers worked. The numbers worked. It was index linked. It was a phenomenal opportunity. And that's why lots went after it. The Tories scrapped it all when they came into power. There's an element of the austerity argument to that, of course, but it did seem more political than sensible to me. Had they cracked on with that, then when we got to 2022 and we had a serious energy supply crisis, we might have been in a far better place from an energy security perspective, which obviously has nothing to do with net zero, but ends up being the same argument, right? Now, the policy for years has obsessively been fabric first, insulation, windows, important but boring for investors, really. Solar plus storage is where the real market is moving. By 2030, a home without a battery could be a stranded asset in the rental market, certainly in parts of the country. But my concern here is the supply chain, because this plan targets 180,000 new jobs, but we are currently facing a massive skills gap in the MCS accredited installers. If you want 3 million solar arrays on roofs, you need a literal army of electricians. Without them, then the upfront costs will be driven by labour scarcity, regardless of how cheap the panels are, right? I suspect the 70% UK made target for heat pumps sounds a bit more like political posturing than actual industrial reality to me. I'll bet the unders on that one, Ed, if you don't mind, if we're going to have a bet. But as usual, this time frame won't happen either. But the real savings and the leap forward in battery tech since the last Labour administration are two very relevant factors. And people are also going to remember in their minds, they're going to remember 2022 and the energy bills and the government energy guarantee and all that concern that it caused them, which is going to mean they're going to be more sympathetic to hedging strategies against future bills, including solar panels, right? I am wondering in the back of my mind just how long it'll be before the overnight rates start to creep up because of the amount of take-up. Greg Octopus probably has a fantastic handle on this, but it might be commercially sensitive information because I can't find it anywhere. So, but it has to be to do with supply and demand. Let's face it, if you've got 3 times as many people or 10 times as many households using overnight electricity, the price of that overnight electricity is not going to be as cheap as it is today, is it? Anyway, what about the rental sector squeeze? Well, the Warm Homes Plan has put a heavy emphasis on standing up for renters by introducing new minimum energy efficiency standards. So this is the EPC C by October 2030, England and Wales. Private renters make up 36% of the fuel poor population. That compares to that 19% of households that they make up, of course. And they often live in the least efficient housing, according to the report. Although I'm not sure that's true when you look at the PRS versus the owner-occupier stock in terms of EPC C. It was very much, very similar. It was about 50-50 in both camps. It was social housing that actually was about 75% C and above because they've already put so much money and had so many grants in order to make those retrofit improvements. So I'm not so sure on the government source there. I think it might be a bit of political naughtiness that's crept into the report. Who would think that would ever happen? But to help landlords comply, the plan keeps BUS grants, the bus grants, available for the rental sector and highlights that these investments can be tax deductible as allowable expenses. Similar standards are being proposed for the social rented sector, supported by the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund. The government warns these rules are essential to hitting the 2030 fuel poverty target. So what's the Propenomix perspective there? Well, this is the part that'll make every buy-to-let landlord in the country reach for the gin, quite frankly. EPC C by 2030 is a big hurdle for Victorian terrace stock that dominates the UK rental market. While the government mentions tax deductibility, that's cold comfort to a landlord facing a £10,000 plus bill for EWI, external wall insulation, and a heat pump. We're already seeing a flight to quality where investors are dumping older, inefficient stock to avoid these looming costs. This could lead to a further contraction in rental supply, pushing rents even higher. The cost cap mentioned in the report needs to be realistic. If it's too high, landlords are simply going to exit. If it's too low, then their targets are absolute fantasy. So on to the fourth theme that I've drawn from the report, the Warm Homes Agency and the delivery challenge. So to oversee this massive transition, the government is establishing the Warm Homes Agency, WHA. New public body consolidating existing functions from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, Ofgem and Salix into one single executive agency. The WHA's mandate is simply to simplify the customer journey, provide impartial advice and coordinate delivery at a local level in partnership with mayors and local authorities. It will also overhaul the consumer protection regime to ensure high quality installations following a National Audit Office review that found these unacceptably high levels of non-compliance in previous schemes. The agency will also work with DNOs, the distribution network operators, to ensure the local grids can handle the increased load from millions of new heat pumps and EV chargers. Propenomix perspective there, well, a quango. Who would have thought it? But consolidation should make sense and mean more efficiency. But this is the public sector that we're talking about, so I guess we'll find out. I have a general rule. When the government creates a new agency to simplify things, it usually just adds another layer of bureaucracy. But if we consolidate the mess of Salix, Ofgem and various DESNZ departments, it's a necessary evil, right? The real test for the WHA will be its interaction with the DNOs. Our local grids are currently the biggest bottleneck in the entire property market. And I know developers have been quoted 3-year wait times for a simple substation upgrade. If the WHA doesn't have the teeth to force DNOs to proactively unloop properties and upgrade local transformers, the whole plan will grind to a halt in the first suburban cul-de-sac that it hits. It's a lovely, bold vision, but delivery will be everything. So what's my most important takeaway from this meaty report? Well, look out for the period when you can ensure your EPC C is a C on an existing property. When we've got a timeline for the HEM phasing in and the RD SAP phasing out, be careful, because some industry analysts have predicted that 15 to 20% of Cs will drop back to a D or even worse. And this is always what happens when methodology around energy efficiency changes that I've observed over the years. This subtle nudge upwards, right? Potentially influenced by tax or mortgage rates or insurance, as we've discussed many times before. It could work and it sounds good on paper, especially in a government write-up of it, but you can tell how sceptical I still remain. So what about the bonus points? Well, let's not look past the fact that the 1st of October 2029, the deadline for the old EPC to still last 10 years, although we're not really clear on what's going to happen after that, as things are still in consultation. It's into the next Parliament, let alone the 1st of October 2030 deadline that's been applied here. So if the current poll leaders win the next election, or they get traction in a right-wing coalition, which looks perfectly possible, then this is all out the window. So what? What should I do about it? Well, should I spend money sensibly at this time and then make the most of the new grant schemes when we get the formal detail? Look, chucking £10,000 of property in early on is definitely not going to be the dominant strategy here. Check carefully how the fabric improvements like windows will impact on this 10k cap. And you must always seek to add value, of course. Most of all, having already been through a 7-figure grant-funded programme of improvements across our portfolio, look after the tenants and make sure the installers do too, because they move on these jobs at a rate of absolute knots because they're working on fixed prices and they leave far too much mess behind apart from anything else. Collaborate, don't fight. Gently point out with the tenants, you've got to work with the tenants here, right? If these upgrades aren't done, it won't be a viable rental property in a few years' time. And the vast majority understand that's not a desirable situation. So, moving on with the Bank of England report now, the irresistibly titled Product Innovation in the UK Mortgage Market, the Case of Green Mortgages. So, first theme in this one is the emergence of the green discount. There's a new staff working paper from the Bank of England, and it provides the first empirical confirmation that green attributes are being systematically priced into UK mortgage contracts. They've analysed millions of transaction level records alongside energy performance certificates, And researchers found, guess what? Energy efficiency became statistically significant pricing factor starting in 2018, which coincides with, excuse me, coincides with the introduction of the minimum energy efficiency standards that year, which does suggest a direct link between regulatory policy and product innovation. The data that reveals the lenders began offering discounts averaging 7.5 basis points, so 0.075% for those who want clarification on what a basis point exactly is. And that was for properties with an EPC of A or B. So this spread is not static, it's dynamically responding to macroeconomic shocks. So for example, when the energy price surge came in 2022, the green discount actually got bigger and widened to 15 basis points or 0.15%. So the finding suggests that banks are treating energy efficiency as a genuine risk factor, offering cheaper capital to borrowers who purchase homes that are insulated from utility price volatility. So what's the Propenomix perspective on that bit? Let's get this academic politeness out of the way. The headlines will scream that banks are paying you to go green, but let's look at the actual numbers. 7.5 basis points on an average mortgage is frankly a rounding error. £200,000 is the average new mortgage in the UK. We're talking about saving 150 quid a year. So 12 quid a month or something like that. Not enough for a dinner out unless you live on your own, let alone to incentivise a homeowner to spend 20,000 quid on external wall insulation and a heat pump. But what's really interesting here is the timing. The banks didn't move a muscle when the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. They only started pricing this in when the government threatened landlords with MEES in 2018, or MEES, and when gas prices went through the roof in 2022. There's no altruism here, it's just risk management dressed up as marketing. The market is pricing in the fact that if you live in a drafty Victorian terrace and gas hits nearly £2 a therm again, as it did in 2022, then you're much more likely to default than the person in the airtight new build next door. It's a credit risk adjustment, plain and simple, and a pretty stingy one at that. So theme number 2 in this report, the new build bias. One of the most striking findings in the report is the skewed distribution of green mortgage lending. The analysis shows that green mortgages, those offering specific pricing advantages for energy efficiency, are overwhelmingly concentrated in the new build sector. 68% of mortgages issued against properties with a green characteristic, EPC A or B, were for new builds, whereas only 3% of standard mortgages finance new construction. Conversely, 97% of standard lending flows into existing stock. So, the authors argue this acts as a mechanism to relax credit constraints for developers and buyers of new homes. By offering cheaper financing costs for the highest rated properties, lenders effectively make marginal development projects financially viable. This suggests that the primary economic impact of green mortgage innovation in the UK has been to stimulate the construction of new housing supply rather than encourage the retrofitting of the country's existing ageing housing stock. And this confirms what I've suspected for a long time, really. Green mortgage is largely just a rebrand for new build mortgage. If you're buying a shiny new box from a volume house builder, you automatically qualify for the cheaper rate because modern building regs force the EPC to be an A or a B. If you're buying a character property that actually needs retrofitting, you're literally and financially left out in the cold. The authors claim this stimulates construction and perhaps on the margins it does help developers to shift units. But for the wider property market, this is a distortion. It's a two-tier financing system where the assets that needed the most investment, the older stock, are the most expensive to finance. We're essentially subsidising the easy wins. If the banks and the government were serious about decarbonisation, they'd flip this on its head and the 15 basis point discount would be to the person who was improving a D-rated property to a C, rather than the person buying the turnkey new build that was going to be built anyway and building reg standards. Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome, as a great man once said in this week's quote. So, theme number 3, the regulatory club. Well, the report delves into the extensive margin of product innovation, essentially asking which banks are bothering to offer these green products. The data indicates a clear divide. Innovation is concentrated heavily among large, systemically important institutions and publicly listed banks. These are the lenders subject to the most intense scrutiny from the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, and the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, as well as pressure from shareholders regarding ESG commitments. Smaller, non-systemic lenders have been much slower to adopt these pricing structures. The authors propose a pressure channel, suggesting that big banks offering green discounts is a strategic move to manage regulatory expectations and signal their compliance. By proactively pricing green attributes, these large institutions effectively lower their own cost of capital and they preempt potentially costlier regulatory interventions down the line. So what's the Propenomix perspective of all of that? Well, this is the tick box economy in action, right? The big boys, Lloyds, Barclays, NatWest, etc., have armies of compliance officers and ESG committees. For them, shaving a few basis points off a mortgage rate is a cheap way to produce a glossy sustainability report and keep the regulators off their backs. It's just a marketing expense. The smaller challenger banks and building societies, who often offer the most competitive standard rates, aren't playing this game because they don't yet have the same gun to their heads. They're looking at the new raw swap rates and credit spreads and deciding that the greenium, as it might be called, just isn't there yet. It tells you that this market isn't being driven by consumer demand, it's being driven by the Prudential Regulation Authority and the optics of being a responsible lender. Until the capital markets just start genuinely pricing green collateral differently, giving banks cheaper wholesale funding for green loan books, this will remain a game for the big listed players looking to polish their ESG credentials. Okay, moving on to Mollior's 2026 January efforts on their first report of the year on residential development in London then. So theme number one is the construction cliff edge. So Mollior paint a stark picture of London's residential development sector entering 2026. You cannot deny the headline figures. Private construction starts have collapsed by 84% over the last decade. In 2015, developers commenced work on 33,782 private homes in London. In 2025, 5,547. While the final quarter of 2025 showed a small uptick, 2,294 starts, which was an improvement on the dismal 882 that were recorded in quarter two of 2025, the aggregate trend is obviously overwhelmingly negative. Compounding this issue is the prevalence of the zombie site. At the end of quarter four 2025, construction had effectively halted on 5,009 homes across 51 separate development sites. Mollior notes that these sites are typically padlocked because the main contractor has gone insolvent due to rising costs, or because the developers deliberately pause work in the face of a weak sales market. So what's the Propenomix perspective? Well, as always, I want us to be clear about what we're looking at here. This isn't a softening or a correction. It's a full-blown capitulation of supply. 84% drop in starts over a decade is not a cyclical dip, right? It's a broken transmission mechanism, and the capital has effectively stopped building private housing. The halted site statistic is particularly nasty. Padlock on the gate means that insolvency, but the inflationary environment that we're in now means replacing them costs significantly more than the original contract sum that was agreed. That destroys the GDV instantly, or certainly the profitability of the project. I've been warning about this for years. The toxic cocktail of spiked material costs, labour shortages, and the cost of debt, thanks to those unyielding SONIA rates, has made building in London a fool's errand for all but the most capital-rich players. If you're holding land and hoping for a contractor to miraculously lower their price, you are dreaming. This is the supply crunch we predicted, and it's going to put a rocket under rents and eventually values, simply because there'll be nothing left to buy. Nothing new to buy, I should say. Theme number two is the fantasy of government targets. So the disparity between political ambition and market reality has never been wider. The government set a target requiring 22,000 starts per quarter to meet housing needs. Against this, the actual pipeline is failing spectacularly. Mollior's analysis of the 37,388 private homes currently under construction means a massive shortfall against the government's 2-year London target. Specifically, the completions shortfall stands at 161,947 homes. That's a 92% failure rate against the target. The report bluntly states that government targets are impossible to achieve. Looking ahead to 2027 and beyond, the forecast supply is a meagre 14,053 homes. It's a tiny fraction, it's just 8% of that 176,000 home target that was set by the policymakers. So what's the Propenomix perspective on all of that? Well, I have to laugh, otherwise I'd cry. A 92% shortfall. In any other industry, if you missed your KPI by 92%, you wouldn't just be fired, you'd be investigated for fraud. Yet in UK housing policy, it's just another Sunday. We need to stop treating these government targets as serious metrics because they're not. Their political wish list is detached from economic reality. You cannot regulate supply into existence when the viability equation is broken. The planners demand affordable percentages that don't stack up. The tax regime punishes the investors who fund the early stages, and the cost of finance remains punitive. The result, a completion forecast for 2027 that sounds like a rounding error. And this is the macro reality. The government is shouting for 22,000 homes a quarter, the market's delivering less than 3,000. The gap between rhetoric and reality is now a canyon. And so for the savvy investor, this screams scarcity. So what do you do about that? Well, if you own a quality asset in London, hold on to it with both hands. The cavalry is not coming to save the new buyers when it comes to supply. So the next theme is the death of the SME and the rise of the oligopoly. So in summary, the Mollior report identifies a structural shift in the London development landscape that won't surprise anybody. It suggests the market is moving towards this natural oligopoly. The barriers to entry for new or smaller developers are just insurmountable. The barriers include elongated timeframes that require a patient balance sheet and expensive construction methods that heavily favour economies of scale. Furthermore, scarce customers are increasingly demanding a proven track record and expertise across every sales channel, which smaller entities often lack. And so the report concludes that these factors are actively excluding smaller developers from the industry. The result will be a consolidated group of larger developers operating with limited competition from 2027. What's the Propenomix perspective there? Well, this is the Amazonification of London property, right? The days of the plucky SME developer buying a Zone 3 plot, getting a cheeky planning uplift and knocking out 40 units for a tidy profit are over, dead and buried. The cost of capital and the sheer duration of the planning process dragging on for years while a bridge loan ticks away at 10% plus means you need a balance sheet that can bleed cash for 36 months without any panic. Only the PLCs and the sovereign-backed giants can do that. Of course, you can get around some of this stuff with clever option contracts and things like that, but your deals need to become more and more creative and less cheeky sideboard at auction, right? So what does it mean for all of us in general? Well, it means the product reaching the market from 2027 onwards is going to be homogeneous, right? Priced by a cartel of survivors and probably drip-fed to maintain pricing power. So the limited competition that Mollior's predicting is effectively a license to print money for the big boys who survived the cull. If you're a small developer, pivot or partner up. If you're an investor, look at who is actually building. That list is getting shorter by the day. And then theme 4, the last theme for this report, the sales vacuum and the mid-market trap. So sales volumes have trapped the decline in construction. They've fallen 68% over the last decade. And in 2025, only 8,436 new homes were sold across the entirety of London. The breakdown of these sales highlights a striking pattern. Individual buyers, both UK and overseas, accounted for only 1,014 sales in Q4, generally at higher price points, while bulk deals and switches to affordable housing accounted for all of the volume, or the vast majority of the volume, at lower price points. So, a specific area of concern is the inventory overhang in the mid to high market. So it's like this dark blue segment of unsold stock that's priced between £1,000 a foot and £1,500 a foot. The report notes that 4,247 homes in that price bracket are unsold. That combines those completing in 2026 and later, and yet Q4 2025 saw just 150 sales in that specific band. That's a tiny fraction, of course, a few percent. What's the Propenomix perspective there? Well, this is the data point that makes you sit up and pay attention. It's a barbell market. At the bottom end, under our £800 a foot, the stock's being mopped up by build-to-rent housing associations because the yield just about works or the developer's just desperate to exit and there's a nice discount. At the very top end, super prime, the money's immune to the mortgage markets anyway. But the middle, the £1,000 to £1,500 per square foot bracket, that's your kill zone. That's where the upper middle class professional or the small scale investor used to buy, and they're just wiped out by interest rates and tax changes. Selling 150 units in a quarter against an overhang of 4,000 plus is no shortage of catastrophic, right? There's decades of inventory at the current absorption rates. It's going to take 33 quarters, to sell all of that. I mean, it's a nightmare, right? Complete nightmare. So if you are holding stock in that premium but not prime bracket, particularly in zones where the international bid has dried up, you are in trouble. We are likely to see aggressive incentives, bulk disposals, or sites just being mothballed until the world changes. The normal UK buyer is absent, and until rates come down significantly, the £1,200 per square foot flat in a tower is just going to sit there empty. Now, Zupla bring up the rear with their alternative analysis snapshot for 2025's figures. Now they're in. Half of homes increasing in value. That was me trying to sound as hopeful as possible because I'm just hearing that half homes aren't increasing in value. Of course, a little bit of glass half empty, glass half full there, arguably. But theme 1 in this report, the great regional decoupling. So you probably know what's coming here, but in summary, the 2025 housing market from Zupla revealed a stark regional hierarchy rather than a uniform national picture. 50% increased in value. The distribution of that 50% is, guess what? Heavily skewed towards the north of the country. Northern Ireland, the standout performer, 94% of homes in Northern Ireland went up in value, averaging a gain of £14,200. So it's really significant because house prices in Northern Ireland are not expensive, although they're getting more expensive quite clearly. This momentum extended to Scotland and the Northwest, which together accounted for the entire top 10 list of local authorities with the highest proportion of rising values. Renfrewshire in Scotland took the top spot with 95% of homes rising in value, closely followed by Glasgow, 90%, and Chorley, 88%. In contrast, the market in southern England has cooled significantly, with the northern regions seeing more than 70% of homeowners recording gains in general, compared to much lower confidence in the south. What's the Propenomix perspective? Well, this data set is the final nail in the coffin for the concept of this single UK property market. I've said for years it doesn't really make much sense to do these things at the macro level, but you get pushed into it with predictions and all the rest of it, and people want to know what the number is for whatever reason. Really, they should care about the number in their investment area, shouldn't they? And that's what I try to predict in-house for Propenomix and for the group of companies that I'm involved in. So we're seeing inevitable arithmetic, really, of yield seeking and affordability changes. The north is booming, not because of some sudden cultural renaissance in the north, but because the numbers still stack up there just about. Because you've got Northern Ireland delivering 94% positive growth, it tells you that capital is fleeing a stagnant, yield-compressed south in search of anywhere that offers a return on equity that beats a standard savings account. The dominance of the Northwest and Scotland in the top 10 list is a signal that the ripple effect, the historic tendency for wealth to flow out from London, has officially turned into a flood. But let's not get too misty-eyed here. A boom in Renfrewshire or Chorley is often just a correction to the mean after years of stagnation. The smart money isn't chasing growth, it's fleeing the crushing debt servicing costs of the south. If you're leveraging London, you're bleeding. If you're leveraged in Glasgow, you might just be breaking even. Or you might even be making a profit if you just whisper it. Theme number 2, the southern supply overhang. So, the report tells us that the data paints a challenging picture for southern England. The market is adjusting to price-sensitive demand and a surplus of inventory. 6 in 10 homes that registered a decline in value during 2025 were located in southern regions. In those areas, only 35% saw their home value increase, a massive contrast to the figures seen in the north. The report cites a dual impact of affordability challenges driven by high base prices and a significant increase in the choice of homes for sale, which has reinforced a buyer's market dynamic. Specific areas have been hit a lot harder than others. Kensington and Chelsea keeps getting mentioned in these reports. 7 out of 10 homes recorded a decrease in value. Similarly, coastal towns and areas like Torbay and Hastings saw price drops in 79% and 78% of homes, respectively. Propenomix perspective there. Well, price-sensitive demand is a nice polite euphemism for nobody can afford the mortgage payments. The south is suffering from a massive hangover after a decade of cheap credit. It was like a bender, really, wasn't it, to be honest? I mean, when base rates were near zero, a 500k mortgage in the southeast was manageable. At current rates, that same debt pile is a monthly financial emergency. The result is exactly what I've been warning about, a liquidity trap where sellers are staring at valuations from 2022 and buyers are staring at affordability calculators from 2026. The fact that supply is rising, creating this so-called buyer's market, is the real story here. It suggests that the holding power of southern owners is cracking. People aren't just selling because they want to move, they're selling because the cost of capital has finally outpaced their ability to pretend everything is fine. The stat about Kensington and Chelsea is particularly telling. Prime London is usually the first to recover, but here it is lagging. This suggests it isn't just a blip, it's the fundamental repricing of asset values in areas where yields have been detached from reality for far too long. Choose life, as Renton might say. A further irony here is that a significant argument for renting rather than owning while prices are going down. I myself rented in 2008, waiting for the market to adjust, and bought a house 29% below its 2008 asking price, and didn't I think I was the cleverest person in the world, in May 2009. Argument for renting in London, strong, amount of stock, dwindling, ergo, still lots of demand and pressure on rents too. So no real answers there for new entrants to that geographic market. What about theme 3, the flight to usable space? So the disparity in performance was not just regional, but also structural. Clear winners and losers in terms of property type. And Zupla have characterised this by space. I've got a different viewpoint here, which you'll find out. But terraced and semi-detached homes proved the most resilient to market pressures in 2025. 56% of them saw consistent value increases across the country. Conversely, the market for flats has faced significant headwinds. Flats were the property type most likely to experience value losses, with 50% of them seeing their value fall by 1% or more over the course of the year. Additionally, properties valued over £1 million face greater pressure, aligning with the broader trend of weakness in high-value southern markets. The data indicates a continued preference among buyers for the attributes typically associated with houses rather than apartments. What's the Propenomix perspective? Well, the death of the flat market has been predicted and indeed commented on many times by me, but 50% of stock falling in value by more than 1% is a brutal statistic. It's not just about the race for space or the post-pandemic desire for a garden office. This is the toxic combination of service charge inflation and the ongoing leasehold scandal. Buyers are increasingly savvy. They look at a flat and they see a liability, not an asset. They see uncapped management fees, sinking funds that act like black holes, and the nightmare of communal repairs. Solicitors are righting the wrongs of years gone by doing a better job of highlighting these drawbacks and therefore putting buyers off. Meanwhile, the humble terrace and semi-detached house continue to be the workhorses of the British property economy. They offer freehold control, usually, and no permission slips needed to change the front door. The weakness in the £1 million plus bracket is also consistent with the cost of capital argument. High value assets are sensitive to interest rates. When money costs 5%, a £1 million asset needs to work hard to justify its existence. A flashy two-bed flat in a high-rise with a gym no one uses and a concierge who's never there simply doesn't make the cut anymore. And then the last theme of this report, the fallacy of the national average. So, the headline might read that half of homes increased in value. The underlying numbers suggest it's a market largely treading water, which I guess it does, doesn't it? 50-50, half went up, half didn't go up or went down. So, across the UK's 30 million homes, the average overall price change was a modest increase, £2,300. While 15.2 million homes saw gains averaging £9,900, 9.1 million homes lost value, with an average loss of £10,800. A further 5.6 million homes remain broadly static, fluctuating within that plus or minus 1% range. This is all on Zupla's figures, of course. Zupla describes this current environment as one where the market is adjusting to higher mortgage rates, leading to choppier and complex market conditions, particularly in the south. What's the Propenomix final perspective then for this week? Well, if you ever needed proof that average is a dangerous word, that's it. A national average rise of £2,300 in real terms is actually, after inflation has been applied, a massive crash. When you factored it in, even at modest levels, to £2,300 on a £250,000 asset, and we know the average price is more like about £275,000, is definitely a loss in purchasing power of about 3% or so after inflation, 2.5% or so in real terms. We're looking at a market where well over half the stock is either losing nominal value or stagnating, and that's been the case since late 2022. What happened in late 2022 again that was of note? Hashtag never forget, Elizabeth. The headline, half of homes increased in value, is technically true but spiritually dishonest ultimately. It masks the violent rotation of capital occurring beneath the surface. The choppier conditions mentioned are essentially the market trying to find a clearing price in a world where free money is gone. For investors, this is the most dangerous phase. If you're sitting on a portfolio thinking property always goes up, you're looking at the wrong column. The reality is this bifurcated market, a nominal boom in the cheap seats in the north, and a real-term correction in the premium seats in the south. Ignore the averages, look at the spreads. We already know that capital growth isn't coming to save you in 2026. I'm still long-term bullish, but remember Keynes also said, in the long run, we're all dead. So, on the back of an amazing property business workshop this past week in London, tickets for the next one are now live. And firstly, after much demand and many DMs, we go where the action is at the moment, to the north, to Manchester. This workshop is in huge demand as we talk about exits. We talk about tax, risk, deal structuring and exit options. Not just for you, but for those who you inevitably will be dealing with to buy assets, portfolios, companies and the likes from. Can you help with their exit? I have over the years, often because they have no real formal plan of their own, and added massive value getting deals over the line. So, we've always got our real life case studies with our own experiences in, and we close with a no holds barred Q&A. Anything individual you've got to consider, or get yourselves a VIP ticket and join us for dinner in a smaller setting with an opportunity to discuss any specific roadblocks or issues in your property business at the moment. Our VIP dinner was absolutely incredible this week, and we got some superb feedback. The upgrade is well worth it. So book your super early bird tickets to get a genuine 20% discount off the face value of the tickets. It's for Wednesday the 22nd of April. It's central Manchester, and the link is bit.ly/PBWTEN10. So, but above all, please remember to keep calm, always listen to or read the supplement and carry on. There will be opportunities abound this year and towards 2030 and beyond. The landscape has been set for a surefire bull run. Capital growth looks set to remain slow-ish at the moment, although if you're in the right part of the UK, you will be well looked after by the combination of that plus inflation. But the big bull run needs a bit of runway first. Although let's see what the FCA and the PRA do around easing those lending requirements again for the self-employed. But let's all have an amazing golden quarter together. It's a case of here we go, in my opinion. Thanks for tuning in, folks.